Good afternoon. Should we wait to make sure everyone's joined us?
I think you can get started, Amanda.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Danielle. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Monroe with the Scotiabank Convention Center and Niagara Falls Business Events. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Post-Pandemic Event Planning, a Legal Perspective with Pitblado, LLP. I just wanted to say that I'm personally so grateful to have very recently been called back to work. And I think important conversations like this afternoon's webinar is how our industry is going to recover and move forward. And it's how we get all of our colleagues and friends back to work as well. We're ready to safely welcome you back, and this is how we're going to do it. So thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to learning more about the future of event logistics from Pitblado. And now I'd like to turn it over to Danielle, VP of Learning and Innovation at CSAE, to go over some housekeeping and the rest of the introductions. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to begin by recognizing that we are meeting in different places across the country today. We acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. CSAE looks forward to developing a fuller awareness of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples so that we may all recognize, honor, and find ways to move forward toward meaningful truth and reconciliation. I'm pleased to welcome our speakers for today's session. I'm so glad that they could join us. Benjamin Hecht and Andrew Buck are both with Pitblado Law. Just a note before I introduce them that today's session is being recorded, and so if you have to step out, don't be concerned. We'll be emailing the recording to everyone who registered later this afternoon. We also have a really large group online. I see some people who are saying hello in the chat. Please do that. So we've got a lot of people online today. So what we're going to do is give our presenters an opportunity to cover as much ground as they can. So they're going to speak for about the first 45 minutes of the session. And then we have saved some time at the end of the session for any questions that haven't been addressed. And so feel free to post your questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to get through to the bulk of them and moderate the questions with Benjamin and Andrew at the end of the session. And so now I'm going to introduce our speakers. Benjamin Hecht is the managing partner at Pitblado Law, and he's got over 30 years of experience in the labor and employment field. He focuses on providing advice to management in both union and non-union workplaces and represents clients in all employment-related matters, including proceedings before labor boards, administrative tribunals, and in court. Benjamin negotiates collective agreements, drafts workplace policies and employment agreements, including executive employment agreements. Benjamin is also recognized by best lawyers in Canada. Andrew Buck has a business law practice and provides guidance about matters that include privacy and data protection, cybersecurity, and anti-spam law compliance. He delivers advice with an emphasis on practical assistance and training to mitigate legal risks that arise in everyday business activities. His provision of timely strategic advice, including guidance for responding to privacy breaches, and he's a frequent speaker and media commentator on privacy and data protection matters. So thank you both. We're looking forward to benefiting from your expertise. So I'm going to hand it over to both of you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. We appreciate that. And thank you, everyone. We can see there's a lot of people here. So very much appreciate the interest. As you heard from the bios, we're at Pitblado Law here in Winnipeg. By way of brief housekeeping, obviously things that we say and what we're seeing reflects our local circumstances. So that would be here in Manitoba. This is regulated provincially. I think I would expect that a lot of what we're going to say is of general application and likely applicable to you no matter where you are. But of course, as we always say, it's important to get your own legal advice because rules can vary in different jurisdictions. I'd also say too, by way of further introduction, as you heard, Benjamin's the employment and labor and human resources, human rights guy. I am the privacy person, but I'm finding these days that our spheres are significantly overlapping. And so we thought it made sense to join up with you today. So we've got the agenda in front of us. Let's get right into it. I think a lot of the times when these issues come in, we have to start from taking a view from 30,000 feet. What are the key issues? Try and slot things into boxes. Once we do that, we then get into what are the things we need to think about, which hopefully gets us towards some sort of answer or guidance for our client. And we'll try and leave you with some do's and don'ts. Again, understanding that this is all fluid or evolving, as Benjamin would say. And so what we're telling you now might be entirely different next week. And unfortunately, that just sort of seems to be the nature of the beast here. Okay, so these are probably the three biggest questions we get asked. Can we ask if people are vaccinated? If we can we ask for proof? And can we insist that people be vaccinated in order to attend? And so I think what we're going to try and do is try and get you to some reasonable guidance and hopefully some answers on these questions, and then some corollaries to that. If you're asking for proof, well, what is it that we're asking for in particular? And what do we do if someone won't tell us the answer? Are we entitled to probe for more? And what should we be saying? So we'll try and get into that and give you some guidance on those points as well here.
And just one comment there, you should always consider when we're giving you these do's and don'ts and this guidance today, that there likely is a difference between people coming into your events and people whom you employ. And we'll touch upon that at various points, but just know that there could be a significant difference between someone who's either being invited to attend or paying to attend an event and someone who's working at the event, either on your behalf or on behalf of the venue.
It's a good point. And in fact, our public health orders, which now of course have been recently changed, but they did say that you had to be vaccinated in order to attend as a member of the public. They did not go into whether or not the employees who were working in those places, movie theaters, sporting events and the like, needed to be vaccinated. So that gets to the distinction, and it's important to keep in mind. You need to ask who we're talking about. Another important issue we get asked all the time is doomsday scenario. What happens if someone gets COVID at our event? What happens if we have created a super spreader? What do we do then? And more importantly, how do we try to avoid that in the first place? So we'll touch on that as well. So I think from my perspective, and I mentioned this at the outset, when I've got an issue that comes up, one of the things that I try to think about is, what are all the various rules and sources of obligations that could apply? And then you've got to go through them analytically and sort of consider all the bases and make sure you've checked everything off. And I think one of the reasons why this is such a complicated area is, and you can see on this slide, we got 8 different sources of law here. First and foremost, follow the public health orders, very important. But then you've got all the various considerations, which sometimes are the same, sometimes are a little bit different. You've got your privacy, you've got your human rights. Those are probably pretty obvious. If you're dealing with a government actor, which we're not really going to talk about today, but you could have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms engaged. The charter doesn't apply to private bodies, although we're supposed to act in a way that's consistent with the charter. And then on the other column here, we've got our occupier's liability. So that's the idea, if someone has a slip and fall outside my house and I have decided it would be a good idea to create an impromptu skating rink on my sidewalk, well then someone might have something to say to me or my insurer about that, because I owe a duty to people who enter my premises. And so that can be an issue when you're hosting an event. Negligence. Negligence is the idea that you're expected to act in a certain way, a reasonable standard of care to people to whom you owe a duty of care is the legal term. What that means is, if you're coming into contact with people, you may owe obligations to act reasonably. And so you can see how COVID would tie into that. Contract, someone comes to your event, you've got a contract. That's the agreement by which they come. So you have to watch that. And then finally, occupational health and safety. Employers have a duty to ensure safe workplaces. I'm sure you've heard about that quite a bit. That is often one of the reasons why we tell employers you may need to consider or insist, in, depending on having vaccination because you have a duty to keep your employees and people in your workplace safe.
On the issue of public health orders, just a brief comment, because they do set the goalposts, but they also offer challenges. So for example, in Manitoba, the most recent public health order has taken away the requirement to mask in public spaces and has instead substituted a mask strongly recommended piece to the order. And of course, many employers and events here to date in the short time since that order came out are saying, well, that's not good enough. We want to go further. So when we say follow the public health orders, I think in part we mean don't do anything less than the public health orders, but a more interesting question that's going to prove to be challenging everywhere as it is today in Manitoba is, well, what if we want to do more than the public health order requires? How are we going to deal with with potential fallout or pushback on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good point. And that's where you probably take your non-lawyer hat off and say, what's public opinion? And you want to do the right thing, but you also want to do right by your customers. And so you're going to sort of stick your finger up in the air and see which way the wind's blowing. And if there's a strong public sentiment for these things, then, you know, all other things being the same, that might be something you take into account when you're running your business. One thing I would quickly say by way of housekeeping, I'm seeing something from Danielle in the chat, which is a good point. The recording of this webinar and the deck will be made available to you after. So if you join in progress, if you're not able to watch the whole session, you can watch for that later. Good folks at CSAE will make that available to you. Okay, so another point here when we talk about variables and trying to consider, well, what even are the rules we have to follow? A lot of it is context specific. And so I talked about public versus private sector. What I think about when I think about that primarily is, do we have to worry about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms because there's certain obligations that apply in that piece of law that might not apply under other laws. And then you can see on the chart, there's some other things we need to think about. Where's the location? Is it inside or outside? What jurisdiction is it in? What laws apply? Maybe there's municipal codes that you need to follow. Is the environment unionized? And that will have an effect on the way you deal with things vis-a-vis your employees. If you are renting a venue, then presumably you're going to have an agreement with the venue owner and they too will have expectations. Hopefully you have a contract that sets those things out. And if you've got insurance coverage, one of sort of the primary objectives, the prime directive is often do right by your insurer, do not do anything that will compromise your coverage. So if your insurance is telling you to do certain things, then you really want to make sure that you're following those things so as to not jeopardize your coverage.
On the issue of unionized environments, of course, there's two sides to that coin for the matters we're discussing today. One is, are you unionized, the event planner, the event organizer? And of course, you'll be governed by the terms of your collective agreement. But also when you negotiate with the venue, your contract, the venue may itself be unionized, subject to a collective agreement for the employees that are going to be in the venue. And that will inform certain terms of your contract for the event, because they may say, well, doesn't matter what you want, our collective agreement requires us to do this to protect our employees in this venue. So that's also an issue that may come up.
It's a good point. And so we do all that to try and give you a sense of all the things that are floating around that you and we need to think about when these issues come up. And so now let's try and get into clearly it's not going to be a black and white answer. If that's what you're expecting, then you may want to turn off your computer now and exit society, because sadly, that's not the way that things work. So what we're going to try and do is give you some things to think about as you and your legal counsel, if necessary, try and start making decisions. The first important thing, and mentioned this already, is if there are public health orders, they are the law. You need to, at a bare minimum, do what those public health orders say you have to do. And I think from a business perspective, and likely you've experienced this or you've heard about this, one of the things that can be helpful about public health orders is not to be too crass, but they give you cover. In other words, I am not saying you have to wear a mask. because this is my rule. It's the government's rule. If you don't like it, take it up with government. And one of the things that happened recently in our province is we went from mandatory masks to masks now recommended. And there were some other changes, but that's one obvious one. And the business community, parts of it were not pleased because then it put the onus on them to police and enforce rather than being able to just say, look, these are the public health orders. You want to make sure that, of course, gatherings are allowed, and if they are, that they're not limited to a size that you want to exceed. If there is a mandatory vaccination, and that is an extreme flux right now, it's probably the biggest issue of our recently called federal election, it would appear. You need to follow that. And finally, with respect to proof, proof is an interesting one. And when a lawyer says interesting, that's usually a bad thing. Because you could be in a jurisdiction where you have a vaccine card, which is what we have in Manitoba. And so if you are double vaccinated and you've passed your 14 days period, then you can apply for and get a physical card, and you can get a QR code on your phone. In that circumstance, it's quite easy for someone to get proof, at least in theory, because you just ask for the card. If you don't have some sort of system like that, then it becomes much different. The point that I would make is it used to be in Manitoba and may still become at some point in the future here, and possibly in your jurisdiction, if elsewhere, that you actually had to take steps to require proof. So it wasn't just enough to say, okay, you have to be vaccinated, but you would have to get the person to prove to you, and presumably that would mean showing the card. So that's another part that you might see in your public health orders.
On the issue of proof there, just for those of you not from Manitoba, which is obviously most of you, the Manitoba vaccine card has no information on it other than your name and a QR code. So it facilitates the proof of vaccination with the minimum amount of personal health information. In fact, nothing other than your name. That's one. And second is that when you use the public health orders for cover, as Andrew mentioned here in Manitoba, the business community said, well, thanks, but thanks for nothing, because you've made an order, but you've effectively left it up to each individual business to decide whether or not to do more than the order. And they're all wrestling with that. And many, many businesses here in Manitoba today are doing more than the order, seemingly without much pushback, as long as you don't want to spend all day down the rabbit hole of social media. But I think that's what's going on right now.
And I have no idea how clear this will show up. Also, I could not have been a surgeon because I don't have clear hands, but this would be what my card would look like. And I'm comfortable showing it to you because it has very little personal information. And then if you flip on the back, you've got your QR code, and Benjamin has his on his phone.
And that's what you get in the Manitoba app on your phone, your name and the same QR code that's on your vaccine card. At least I hope it's the same one.
And I saw something come up. I know we're going to answer questions at the end, but it was an interesting point. What do you do if you're dealing with attendees who are coming from outside your province? And our local football team had an issue with that because they initially said, and still do, you have to be fully vaccinated to attend football games, Blue Bombers football games. And initially that meant you have to be fully vaccinated and have a Manitoba card. And the question was, well, what do we do from people who are outside the province? And particularly when our friends, and I use the term loosely, from West come for our Banjo Bowl, they're not going to have Manitoba health cards. And so I know the Bombers did something to smooth that out, but I can't for the life of me remember.
They did. They actually set up a separate tent at the entrance for people who had vaccine proof of vaccination from elsewhere in Canada. Don't know if it covered the United States. And I know someone who went to the home opener from British Columbia, and he showed his BC proof of vaccination, and they accepted it and let him into the game.
So we've got a public health order. This was a sample one that used to be in place in Manitoba. And then here's a second one, and you could see some of the things we've highlighted here. If you wanted to be at a food table, you had to be double vaccinated. And then here were some of the operations or obligations rather that you had to take if you were an operator of a facility. So asking for proof, identification, etc.
And of course, that's as with anything and everything related to this intricate and complex topic, there's an example of a real challenge for a venue, such as a food court in a shopping mall, where the expectation is, like in a restaurant had been, if you were going to sit at a table with people, you should either all be double vaccinated or from the same family unvaccinated. But who was policing that? You know, so in theory, and the tables were now at full capacity and very in close proximity to each other. I don't think that the food court staff would be walking around asking people at individual tables for proof. They're just going on the primary pillar of the rules of COVID, which has been since day one, the honor system until vaccine passports came out.
So really, when we look at this conceptually, I think there's three things here that we have to consider. Necessity, do you need to do whatever it is you want to do? Proportionality and effectiveness. So that's the idea that whatever infringements there might be, you're going to get a countervailing benefit that outweighs those infringements. And it needs to actually do what it is you say it's going to do. And then I think, to me, the most important part, and again, interesting, there's that word, is this accommodation, because there can be different reasons why people aren't double vaccinated. There can be people who do it because of personal choice, and there can be people who do it because medically they are unable. They may be under the age of 12, and so there's no vaccine for those people. And so I think fertile ground for a human rights complaint might be a policy that doesn't recognize the need to accommodate where human rights laws apply, which would include provision of services, i.e. having someone come to your event. And so I think in general, what we're looking for here is balancing the needs of the many, outweighing the needs of the few, as our friend Mr. Spock would say. And I think there's been some recent case law from the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, and I got a quote to share from you, and they say, "No one's safety should be put at risk because of others' personal choices not to receive a vaccine. Just as importantly, no one should experience harassment or unjustifiable discrimination where there are effective alternatives to vaccination status policies." So personal choice is not something you can make a human rights complaint about, but you certainly can if the door is being closed to you because you aren't able to get vaccinated on a ground we recognize as protected under human rights law. So let's get into now and unpack those three concepts. So this idea of necessity, I think a lot of the times where people get tripped up is because they don't actually take a second to go through the analysis. They don't have a piece of paper in front of them and say, okay, do we actually need to do this? And I say that because if you are working in you're cutting grass and nobody is close to anyone else and you're outside, do you really need to have people be vaccinated? And I think that probably would not pass muster because you're outside, people aren't close together. And so what you need to do is you need to start thinking about your risks, and you can see them on the slide. So are we indoor? Are we outdoor? Are there lots of people here? Is there the ability to social distance? Is there a social aspect? Is there alcohol served? Alcohol lowers inhibitions. How long is the event? And then there's the other stuff that you can't control, which is what's the state of COVID in whatever jurisdiction you're in, what's Delta like, and all of these things. And so ultimately what you want to do is you want to establish this is the risk and this is what we're trying to do, not only because it will help you decide what's appropriate, but because if you do get a human rights complaint, being able to show that you did that analysis and you turn your mind to that is going to help put you in good stead.
And just to be ridiculous for a moment, because much of what we deal with related to these policies involves considering what might be ridiculous. While it's true that the person cutting your lawn probably doesn't need to be vaccinated or wear a mask, what if he works for a lawn service company and they drive you to the locations in a vehicle where there's 3 or 4 of your workers together indoors in a vehicle in close proximity? That might cause you to look at it with a different lens.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And again, that's why this is all context suspicious. That's suspicious.
Specific.
It is too. Specific. Okay, so now talking about the second hurdle, and this is probably the main event in terms of the analysis, this proportionality and effectiveness. If these words are seeming similar to you, perhaps you attended a constitutional law class, because this is basically the test that we do under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so under the Charter, we have certain rights that cannot be overridden unless overriding them is justified. And that's what we call a Section 1 analysis, if you ever hear about that in the news, or the Oakes test, because that's the case that it came from. And so the three questions that get asked are what you see on the slide. So is it actually rationally connected? Is what you want to do going to be effective? Well, I think there's lots of evidence that suggests that vaccinations are effective and reduce the risk. The minimal impairment. So is there another way? It's not saying that you must pick the most minimally impairing way, but you have to at least turn your mind to it and pick something that's within a range of acceptable alternatives. And then finally, the proportionality analysis. And sometimes when I look at these tests, I feel like they're sort of saying the same thing three ways, which is, look, what good are you doing? And does it outweigh whatever negative effects there might be? Okay, so now this is going to take us into accommodation. So accommodation is a duty that applies under human rights laws, but it also bleeds into the balancing analysis that you have to do under any of these obligations we talked about earlier. And it's the idea that's saying we're going to apply the same rules to everybody across the board. Sometimes just doesn't cut it for various reasons. Sometimes we have to have what we would call substantive equity, and that's the idea that in order to be quote unquote fair to people and allow full participation, we need different rules for different people. And so applying that to this situation, if someone has a reason that is reflected under human rights laws as a quote unquote protected ground, then if they can't get a vaccination because they have a medical condition, or they're too young, or if there's a religious belief, and I haven't seen any religious beliefs prove that yet. I think a lot of the major religions have come out in favor of vaccines, but still it's there as a protected ground. Sex, that comes up in terms of pregnancy. I'm certainly no medical expert, but there would need to be a question about whether someone's pregnancy precluded them from getting a vaccination. If the reason is due to one of those things, then you have a duty to accommodate them to the point of undue hardship, which means that you need to try and find alternative ways to maintain safety. And we can talk in the slides that follow about what that might be.
I'm just going to give a brief comment about accommodation. So the protected grounds, which Andrew just touched upon, they're really pretty narrow and few and far between at the moment. The medical reasons are the most common reasons being given for people saying, I can't get vaccinated. But for an event, for an employer, in most applications, you'd have to present a medical certificate from someone that would explain the reason, and there aren't very many at present. They include, being immune compromised or being on medication that you would have to go off in order to get vaccinated, which would put you at greater risk. So then the other measures that we're talking about, we've spoken about, and they're not a surprise, which are masking and distancing. And many of these policies have always been known as VOM, vaccine or mask. But the evidence suggests, and again, we're not the experts, but when we read it, it suggests that the vaccines provide more safety than masking. And of course, people would say, well, vaccines plus masks plus distancing is the best safety we can have, other than just staying home. And I think everybody's had enough of staying home. So if you're not distancing, for example, at the Bomber game or at the Jets, or I think the Blue Jays are distancing because they're only letting 15,000 people in right now, then the evidence would suggest vaccines will provide better protection than masking, especially when you can't distance. So the reality is that even with a fully vaccinated crowd in any venue, your venues, a sporting event, you're going to see people wearing masks, likely because they don't feel safe in the environment without the mask and they're just so accustomed to wearing it. But of course, the mask is going to be a bit of a scarlet letter at some point in time, which may signify to others, well, that person's not vaccinated and therefore they're wearing a mask. But we're all going to have to get used to that. But I still expect you're going to see masks in many places even when people are double vaccinated.
Thank you, Benjamin. So that takes us to our next slide, which is our favorite answer. Okay, so can we actually ask for proof and require those vaccinations? And the answer, of course, is it depends.
So maybe we should just leave it at that, and everybody should just have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for your time. I think like a lot of things in Canada, we have case law that interprets and tells us what our laws mean. So we're waiting for these decisions to make their way through the courts and the human rights commissions and the privacy tribunals of the world. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a couple cases. There's some case law out of British Columbia that very clearly says personal choice is not a protected ground. If you don't want to wear a mask because you just don't want to, or you don't want to get vaccinated because you just don't want to, or you don't think it works, those aren't protected grounds, and that's not a basis for you to say you've been discriminated against and you're going to make a human rights complaint. So
you could still make the human rights complaint, by the way, it just wouldn't likely be accepted.
Well, and that's a point that sadly we tell our clients all the time, which is anybody can sue anybody for anything.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be a nuisance factor associated with dealing with that, which speaks, I think, to communications and expectations setting, because look, generally you want to make your customers happy. But one of the things that can help is if you could deal with that and nip it in the bud before it becomes a human rights complaint, it's going to save you a lot of pain and heartbreak down the road. We've talked about where the sources of law come from. We talked about some overriding principles. These would be almost like a checklist that I would look for in terms of, are these things that are in place? And if they are, do they suggest that we could require vaccinations and proof of vaccination in our event? And so the public health order is obvious. You got to comply with the law. You've got your employees there who are coming into close contact with attendees. You don't want to make your employees in an unsafe workplace. Your case counts are still very high. The event is inside as opposed to outside. You've got people close together, so you can't social distance, and people are coming in from other areas. So these would all be things that would suggest that vaccination might be okay to insist upon at your event and legally defensible. It doesn't mean that because you don't have one, you can't do it, but conversely, it doesn't mean that just because you have one or two, you can. But again, the more of these you start seeing, the stronger I think your case is going to be. All right. So then other factors here would be you've got lots of people there. Talked about riskier activities. There's some evidence that suggests that inhibitions are lowered when there's alcohol served. You look at history because as one of our law partners says, the best predictor of the future is the past. Non-essential services. So that's very important because it's one thing to deny people access for an essential service. And you can think about what those might be versus an event. Events are, of course, very important. We're not saying they're not important, but they're clearly not something you need in order to survive. And so for a non-essential service, that might be helpful for you to try and justify what it is you're doing. And then again, that case-by-case accommodation is a very important piece and can help support you. Benjamin spoke about that, the vaccine or mask. I think the Conservatives federally just said today that if you're not going to be vaccinated, then you need to submit to frequent testing. And I think the Calgary Stampede went with vaccinations or rapid testing. So these are all things that might support. Now, on the other hand, there are things that might not support. And it's important to know that at the end of the day, we're hoping that all of this is going to be transient and eventually we won't have to do it, or at least not all the time. And so just because you might be able to insist on vaccinations at one event doesn't mean necessarily that you may at the other. And so you can see some things on this slide, low case counts. We somehow managed to achieve herd immunity. There's no requirement in a public health order. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it's just something that might be suggestive of making it harder to justify. You got an outdoor event or essential services, or it's a short event. So I think a lot of this is common sense, but it can be very helpful to have a checklist in front of you because it helps you turn your mind to all of these things. This is a very important thing, and we talked earlier about the importance of trying to define your risks. because it's the nature of the risk of your particular event that will dictate ultimately what measures might be reasonable. And so if you can mitigate that risk through other measures, and I think these are things that are probably old hat to all of us. So that's your rapid testing, your masks, your distancing, sanitization, plexiglass. It doesn't mean that you don't necessarily do these things anyways, but if you could conclude that, you know what, the risk isn't that high in lieu of all these things, what you're going to, it may be harder to justify what it is you want to do. And I appreciate that I'm not a doctor, and likely many of you are not either. And that's why we're really relying on medical advice. I mean, ultimately, these are legal issues, but they're legal issues that are driven by the facts of the situation and medical advice. But I think summarizing all this, I would say a hard set, no vax, no attend rule is going to be very hard to justify. If nothing else, you have to turn your mind and show that you turned your mind to your duty to accommodate. And it may be that you decided that there was no way we could accommodate. There was no way that we could allow people to come in unless they were vaccinated, because all these other measures wouldn't work or wouldn't eliminate the risk. And if you've made that decision, then you've made that decision. But to just roll out a policy without even turning your mind to it, if there's a human rights complaint and the investigator starts asking questions, it's not a good look if to the response of, well, how did you accommodate people? You say, oh, well, we didn't. We said you had to be vaccinated. And so there's case law that says that there is no separate procedural duty to accommodate. But I think in practice, the human rights commissions of the world, when they're doing their investigations, are going to be looking for that.
And that again illustrates the challenge of the practical application of these policies, which is if you're going to say we require you to be vaccinated to attend our event, whatever it might be, then the practical issue is, are you asking me to provide you with proof of vaccination when I purchase my ticket remotely, online, however, in which case I may have an opportunity to tell you why I can't get a vaccine card and therefore why I would like to be accommodated. It's a lot more challenging if you're doing that at the gate, so to speak, and you're trying to talk your way into an event for which you have a ticket, but you don't have the required vaccine proof. Now you have to consider, do I have a separate entrance for these people? Do I have staff to deal with the issues? Am I going to just be practical and say, well, you can come in, but you have to go over there to the mask zone? Real practical issues that have to be considered, again, in part for practical reasons. And secondly, as Andrew said, in part to deal with any potential fallout from a human rights complaint to show that you acted reasonably.
Yeah, well, it's a good practical point. All right, well, let's shift to, unfortunately, it turns out that your event was an event at which someone got COVID. And I'm mindful of the time here. I'll pick it up a little bit. Brevity is not a strong suit, but I'll try. We've got over 99 comments in the chat, which means there's obviously a lot of questions out there. I think the most important thing I would say here is take a deep breath. This is not strict liability. You are not immediately responsible if someone contracts COVID, because you're not a guarantor of people's personal safety. This isn't one of those things where you do it and immediately you're sunk. Like we've been saying all along, did you act reasonably? Because your defense to any steps that someone might take or a workplace safety and health complaint is, did we act reasonably? Did we do all of the things that we've been talking about earlier in terms of trying to make sure that the event was as safe as it could reasonably be? And if you did those things, I don't know anyone who's going to hold you to a standard of perfection. Okay. So here are some of the things that a court's going to think about. If you are the owner of the venue, so who's responsible? Owner is the person who's responsible under occupier's liability, but if it's your event, notwithstanding that you don't actually own the facility, you could still be responsible because you've got control over it. If you're bringing people in and they're paying as opposed to just wandering through, you have a higher standard expected to them. Make sure you're following all those rules that we've been talking about. Make sure you're doing all the things Public Health Authority of Canada is telling us to do. CDC is American, but they have excellent resources for event planners, and so does Public Health Authority of Canada. And then waivers. We get asked a lot about waivers. Courts hate waivers. They try not to enforce them because they can be unfair, but a properly crafted waiver can definitely be a tool in your arsenal. And it needs to be specifically worded and actually cover the particular risk. It needs to be communicated to people and there has to be acceptance. But if you're able to do all those things, then certainly that's a risk mitigation tool you can and should be thinking about, keeping in mind that you have to be careful not to annoy or offend your event attendees. So it's always a balance. Okay, have a policy. We'll leave this slide with you, but you can see here some of the things that we should talk about. Why? Because we want to avoid arbitrariness. We want to, again, make sure you're turning your mind to it. You're acting reasonably. You're answering all the questions that you should have answered and taking a step that's based on an informed approach. And so these are all the things that you might include in a policy to make sure you've got a good plan in place. Benjamin talked about this. I saw some comments popping up. You want to try to have the discussion and the dialogue with people before the event happens, because then if there is an issue, you can talk about it and hopefully resolve it, rather than having a problem at the door, which could be more volatile and totally gum up the works in terms of letting people in. And in terms of the messaging, depends on who you're talking to. If you're speaking with someone who is an anti-vaxxer, your message might be different than if you're speaking to someone who's vaccine hesitant, because there's a distinction between the two terms. But what you want to explain to people is, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. If you're not vaccinated, here's what we'll do for you. And yes, you can ask questions and we'll chat with you. And here's the designated contact person. If nothing else, that way you're going to get consistent messaging inside your organization. The screening process, I'll admit that you folks are the experts here, not me, but it would seem to me that you're going to want to make sure you're following those screening tools that are put in place. In Manitoba, we have one from Shared Health, which is like our central public health authority. And they've got some very good information you can use and ask people to determine whether or not there might be a particular risk. And so again, the dialogue is an important part. And this gets to the question of, what do we do when someone says they're not vaccinated, and what questions are we permitted to ask them? And I think the approach of many people is to say, well, it's a personal information, or it's a personal decision, privacy, you can't ask. But I think from my perspective, if I was advising someone, I would say that there are circumstances under which you're entitled to ask questions. And we talk about what those are on this slide.
And generally, some people have been taking a bit of a backdoor approach and just saying, will you volunteer the information to me that you're vaccinated, as opposed to, are you vaccinated? But that's different than asking for proof, of course.
And what you want to do is, you don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole and run afoul of privacy laws by asking for information you don't need. You want to keep your questions limited. You want to keep them tailored. And what you want to do is figure out why they can't be vaccinated, because that's the way that you'll help accommodate them. It's not about demonizing or pointing fingers. It's about, we want to try to accommodate you. But as the Supreme Court of Canada has said, accommodation is a multi-party inquiry, and therefore someone who is seeking an accommodation, it's incumbent on them to provide information to facilitate that. So proving the vaccine status, we touched on this earlier. If you live in Manitoba, you might have vaccine cards, and so that's an easier way to do it. If not, then it gets a lot more difficult. I have seen on the chat different people talking about in their jurisdictions some of the things that are there. I know my brother lives in Alberta, and they've got a sheet of paper that someone wrote and signed on. And so it really depends on where the attendee is from. I think one thing I would be careful about here is, again, as I said, we're not doctors. You don't want to be going down the rabbit hole and trying to second guess people when they claim medical issues, because that's not who we are. And also, you don't want to be tying up the line when you're trying to bring people into your event. Okay. So this is another piece. This is a cardinal rule of privacy, which is you ask only what you need to know and no more. And so, are you vaccinated? Yes or no. If you're vaccinated, good. You don't need to know when they were vaccinated, as long as you say, are you vaccinated and you've had your 14 days. You don't need to know what type of vaccine either they were or they weren't. And you can see from the 3 bullet points at the bottom of the slide, asking for the proof, okay, asking for the basis for the decision. That I think is probably a fairly aggressive opinion. I don't think every lawyer would tell you you're entitled to ask for that, but I think when you consider the duties of accommodation and that those duties only arise if you have a protected ground, how is the event planner or the employer supposed to know if they have a duty to accommodate if they don't know the basis for the decision? Now, once you've established it's a protected ground, you don't need to know what that is. So if you tell me it's a medical condition, I'm not entitled to say, okay, well, what's your diagnosis? Once you have given yourself and you've gone within that protected ground box, then that's where the questioning stops, because you now know you have a duty to accommodate. I think we've said this before, and we said it again, we'll say it 6 ways from Sunday. Follow those public health orders, make sure you're checking up on them. You've got Health Canada's guidance document, reducing COVID-19 risk in community settings, a tool for operators, excellent practical advice there as well. I saw a comment about insurance. Contact your insurance broker. They can explain your policy to you. And it's good to know if there's anything in particular you should or should not be doing in order to maintain coverage. And finally, look, all of this is fluid, all this evolves. If we gave this presentation 3 weeks ago, we'd be saying different things than what we're saying right now, because that's the world in which we live. And so 1:47, 2 minutes
Pretty good
schedule, but pretty good, I think. We'll flip it back now for questions from the floor, please, which I understand are going to be moderated by Danielle.
which is going to be a challenge, given that there's probably hundreds of questions out there now.
So there are, as you said, 100 questions, a lot of different scenarios. The decision tree is an old wood, redwood tree, I think is what we're getting. But a lot of questions relate to, we're asking for, if we ask for proof of vaccination, or if we ask, are you vaccinated, is that enough? Or do we actually have to have seen the proof from a liability perspective? So I've asked you if you're vaccinated, you've told me that you are. Do I have an obligation to actually confirm that?
Well, that might be a question for your insurer, first of all, because if you're trying to protect your liability and not run afoul of your insurance policy, I think that's the first place I would start, which is asking my insurer, is it good enough if I rely on, again, pillar 1 of the pandemic, which is the honor system? Somehow I doubt it from an insurance perspective, but they may say that's reasonable, but it's certainly not as effective as having the proof. What's the point of asking for if you're vaccinated if you can lie?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that, because from a privacy perspective, I'm not sure that you really give up that much more if you're telling someone yes or no, I'm vaccinated, and then you show the proof, because the real critical piece is, yes, I'm vaccinated. I showed my vaccine card. What does that really tell you that my declaration didn't already tell you? And someone saying, I don't want to provide proof, starts to look to me like someone who maybe doesn't have or doesn't want to be called to account to what they just told you.
And just related, I think, the CDC going into the United States, traveling from Canada, asks you to sign an attestation where you verify that you have received a negative COVID test in the 3 days prior to travel. But that form isn't worth much on its own without, of course, additionally presenting to the gate or the ticket agent or whoever at the airport your proof of vaccination. The attestation isn't worth it without the proof. The attestation isn't in and of itself proof. And I saw somebody pop up a comment that said they asked their insurer, and the insurer said, ask for proof, don't go with the honor system. So
there were other questions earlier in the session about what is a reasonable accommodation. So if you say everyone who comes into this room has to be vaccinated, if you're not vaccinated, you can participate virtually. Are you obligated to let people into that space?
The virtual space or inside the actual facility?
Inside the actual facility. Like, is the accommodation to meet you, the attendee, the way you want to participate? Or can I say, hey, this is open, but you can participate online?
Well, I would think that if they could come in anyways, then there really wouldn't be a rule in the first place. So I think the accommodation would be a reasonable, not a perfect accommodation that sort of meets everybody in the middle. In other words, it's not an accommodation if you get to come into my event anyways, because I've made an exception to the rule, and that's not what accommodation is.
Right.
So to me, yeah, I think if you can do online attendance or virtual attendance for event planners, I think that's an excellent way, especially because a lot of your constituency is probably used to that already. And sure, they won't get the in-person, but I think for you folks in particular, you can't do a virtual football game. That's a little bit different.
It's called television.
It's called television, watch it on TV. But for you folks, I think that's probably an excellent and a pretty obvious way to try to accommodate someone.
Because I think the alternative accommodation is, as we touched upon earlier, you have an unvaccinated persons section in your venue where people will be distanced and masked. But depending on the type of event, if it's a trade show where you're trying to walk around to booths, that will work very well.
Or if it's a multi-day event and you'll be serving
Right.
food throughout the days,
Right.
masks are going to have to come off. Going back to the privacy issue, if you're asking people for proof of vaccination and you're doing that in the registration process, are you storing that information, and what's your obligation if you're doing that?
No, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. You are absolutely not storing the proof. You are not taking pictures. You are not taking photocopies. All you are retaining is we checked and the person was or wasn't.
You're just ticking a
That's
box that says John Doe provided proof of vaccination.
That's right. There's no need to restore that or retain that copy for later use. It's just, and that's across the board. That's a no-no. So not something that you want to be doing.
Other questions are relating to, sort of what questions you're asking. If everyone's vaccinated, are you still obligated to have some type of pre-screening assessment? How many layers are we piling on to this?
I would think that given the science that seems to be that while rare, it's still possible for people who are fully vaccinated to contract COVID and certainly to shed it. It seems to me that you would still want to at least ask that basic screening. Now, again, that's sort of the perfect solution versus what's reasonable for you and your constituency. And that may involve a business decision about that's too much work. It's not worth the benefit. And I understand that. And I understand that the lawyers are typically going to tell you to belt and suspenders it up, right? So, but I think from my perspective, I could still see there being a risk. And so there'd be value to asking the screening.
Well, I think there absolutely is a risk. We know definitively that Delta doesn't respect the vaccines. And so you can still get sick. You may, and hopefully will get less sick, but you will get COVID. And so I think that a double vaccinated requirement in a venue will still see people asking some of the questions. I'm not sure I see the value in asking, have you traveled outside the province in the last 14 days? But I do see a value in asking, are you exhibiting any symptoms of COVID? Are you waiting for a test result? But again, honor system. And what do you do with the person who says, yes, they're double vaccinated? Again, on your decision tree, you'll have to put that rung in the ladder.
We have a few questions about if someone is providing proof of vaccination because they want to make it simple for themselves as the event planner. And I think you've already said you can't take a picture of that. You can't store that electronically. So are you asking at the door? Is that the...
Yeah, that's a good point, because how do you do that in advance if you're not taking it? I suppose if you're doing it in advance, what you could do is get the proof and immediately delete it. The concern that I have
How do you
is,
match it up at the door again? Yeah.
how do you match up at the door? And also nothing is really deleted and there's metadata, which I think any event that I've gone to that's required proof of vaccination has always been at the door. There may be enterprising people who have figured out a good way to do it, but I think that might be one of the practical reasons why they don't do it. Now, again, you communicate that ahead of time.
That's what I would say.
But-
Communicate it so that the people who want to ask for an accommodation have a chance to ask and you have a chance to assess whether you can or cannot.
And also too, so that people know that that's the expectation so they can be ready for it.
Oh, we have someone from Texas. Yeah, and I think we've established that storing information is not something that that we're recommending that you do. So you've talked about some of the accommodations that you can say duty of care. So if you've got unvaccinated people that you're going to allow into it, then do you just request masks for everyone, or do you?
I think it's a challenge. I really do. And I think, the virtual option is the safer option because, of course, in theory, you're subjecting your employees, the venue, the other attendees to added risk if you're letting unvaccinated people in to mingle and you want them to mingle at your event. So that's a challenge. I saw someone pop up a question. Well, if you put them over into the unvaccinated section with the masks, are you discriminating against them? Well, you are, but it may be a reasonable exercise of your rights to keep the rest of your people safe. And so they can complain again, but their complaint might not have much merit to it. They may feel ostracized, but again, if it's personal choice, but it just circles back as it just continues to be circuitous to what Andrew said, which is, well, why would you let them in the first place then?
I guess it's also the questions as the organizers we have to ask is what level of policing are we going to be comfortable doing on site at an event that is presumably for the benefit and pleasure of our members, and those types of potential on-site battles might not be worth it.
No, that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
And how many more staff do you have to hire to act as the police?
Public health. So a lot of the questions are also relating to comfort. If, even if you put all the measures in place, people still may not want to come, or they may want to come, but then, request refunds. And I think those are probably questions for us as event planners to ask and not necessarily legal questions. But we're coming to 3 minutes. Are there any last thoughts as you've seen what these questions are as they're coming up that you want to share with this group?
We're okay if you want to go over by a couple minutes with some more questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so question about staff. Are we allowed to ask staff vaccine status?
Well, that depends on, go back to your decision tree and your policy. If you've decided to make a policy that your employees need to be double vaccinated in order to maintain 2 levels of safety, one, safety for them and each other in their interactions with each other in your own workplaces, and 2, to protect them, actually 3, to protect them from interactions with the people coming into your venue and event, and 3, so that your event attendees feel safer knowing that all of your staff are double vaccinated. And I know businesses here have done both. In other words, they've said, we want you to be safe, and we're telling you our employees are safe. So when you come into our facility, all of our employees and staff members are double vaccinated. And some of them are saying, and by the way, we'd still like you to wear a mask, and we're going to try and limit our capacity so we can be 6 feet apart, which really makes it even safer than it was 8 months ago when all we did was stay 6 feet apart and mask.
And I think another thing I would say too is that, of course, assumes that there's a reason for vaccination in the first place, as opposed to a workplace where everybody's working from home or outside, etc.
There are a couple of questions about what questions can you ask of your venue? What are your expectations? I think you covered it a little bit before, but can you touch back on that, where collective agreements may sort of get in the way of what your desires is to say everyone at this venue is going to be vaccinated because we said that?
Well, I think that's that would come at the time you go to book the venue. You would, not my business, but I expect from what I've seen, the venues are going to have their own contracts and terms and conditions, and they're going to tell you the whats and the whys, and they won't tell you necessarily that it's because they have a collective agreement that requires it, but they'll tell you these are the rules of our venue. If you'd like to come here, my way or the highway, follow our rules.
So you can ask it, but you can't mandate it if they're not willing to do that.
You can ask the venue why they have the policy. I don't think they have to tell you that.
No. I mean, and then I think your remedy is to go deal with another venue.
Right.
That's something that's.
And maybe they'll collude and they'll all have the same rules and there'll be a level playing field, but maybe not, likely not.
Yeah.
And if attendees are indicating to you, I'm still not comfortable, you're following public health guidelines, what is your obligation to continue to accommodate and to continue to add additional measures for the comfort of your attendees?
What might they be asking you to do that you're not doing?
Perhaps you're in a province where the mask mandate has been, is no longer a mandate of public health, but now you're asking attendees to mask.
I think that's personal choice. So if you say I'm following public health and public health right now says I can have this many people and it's mask strongly recommended but not required, so I'm not requiring anybody to do more than the public health order, and somebody says I want you to do better, I think you have to shrug and say, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to, and we're complying with the public health order, and you're going to have to find another event where you feel safer or attend our event virtually.
And I think, Danielle, that's a really good question, because we typically think about human rights, at least I do, from the perspective of the attendee who doesn't want to be vaccinated or is unable to be vaccinated. But what about someone who has a health condition such that they're at higher risk, and are they entitled to demand accommodation from you? And I think the answer there is you can attend virtually or just don't come to our event. So I agreed with Benjamin.
That's the needs of the one versus the few versus the many.
That's right. I think if you're following the public health orders and you're doing everything that's industry specific, then I think that's a customer relations issue more than a legal one.
And maybe that first question on that decision tree goes back to, does this have to be in person right now, or should it continue to be a virtual event while a lot of these questions get sorted? I know, Benjamin, before we started, you mentioned something that, a lot of these cases that are going to go to human rights tribunals won't ultimately be decided for 7 years or longer. So we're going to be living in uncertainty for a little bit longer, I think.
Yes, for sure we are. And as we said at the beginning, this doesn't look the same as it did on March 13th or 15th, 2020. And it's taken many twists and turns, and it evolves daily. I saw our friend Mr. Strauss pop up on the screen. Here's something new today from the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, which we haven't read yet, but it's coming out fast and furious every day, all day, and we all have work to do. We can't just sit and read everything that's coming out, but we try, and it does evolve, and it's very challenging. We empathize. It's challenging to plan events. It's challenging to plan anything, to plan family visits, to plan business travel, to plan vacations. It's all easier to just stay home. And after 18 months, people have had enough staying home, so they want to start living again. And slowly people are going to try. But if it gets worse, we'll have to take a step back, as we have several times in the provinces. Our codes have changed from red to orange to yellow. I don't think we've seen a green yet, but we're all dealing with it every day.
So thank you both for clearing some of this murkiness for us. There's a lot, and we'll probably have to have you back in a few months to see where the situation has evolved to. So thank you on behalf of the participants. Once again, the recording will be available. I see Michelle asked if we could make the chat available too. I think we can do that. And thank you both, and thanks to all of our participants. I hope this was helpful to you.
Our pleasure. Good luck to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.